Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really happy to see a lot of you here again. Oh, hang on. Would help if I turned it on. Let's see, there's an on-off button there. Okay. Thank you. I feel like I'm a member of this congregation, having been here several times before, and it's always kind of a special treat. So I'm very happy that you invited me here today. Those of you who were here on my previous presentation know that I'm really a Georgia boy. Grew in the South, but from Georgia. So what am I doing talking about Mississippi? I mean, I actually never went to Mississippi, except technically I was on a train one night in New Orleans. I got on a train when I was 15 in New Orleans, and I woke up the next morning and I was in Alabama. So have I been to Mississippi or not? Well, what happened, I think, as an introduction was some of the Mississippi quote-unquote cousins, not really blood relatives, but people who also had a Southern heritage, discovered Southern Fried Rice, which was the memoir about my family's growing up as the only Chinese family in our town. And they sort of related to it, and some of them said, oh, your experience is very similar to ours, you know, and do you know much about the Mississippi Chinese, and would you want to maybe write something about them? And so at that point I was really not quite sure whether to jump into this or not, but I met a lot of very nice people Chinese people from Mississippi who gave me lots of information, photographs, and we talked, and one way or another it's kind of developed into this book that I call Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton, you know, just to be a little flowery. So, for those of you who have never been to Mississippi, this is a rough, this is the, my little red dot doesn't show up too well. Okay, the Mississippi River dividing Mississippi from Louisiana and Arkansas. And this part is the region which is called the Delta. And in the overall state here, you can sort of see it's this little edge that... Oh, thanks. Okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, much right. All right, so the part on the Arkansas side also, you can think of as also being the Delta, because basically this is where the river, the Mississippi River, deposited a lot of rich soil that was very fertile for agriculture, particularly cotton. And without getting into a history of Mississippi economics, we know that cotton was a major crop in the South, not just Mississippi, but since we're talking about Mississippi, this is where the plantations were at the white developed, and they hired a lot of black people. They weren't called African American at that time, so I'm not going to use that term. So they were sharecroppers, and they would work in the fields all day, and then they had to get their supplies, their food, and other provisions. And usually these plantations had what would be called company stores or commissaries. And so you worked, and then you get the food from sort of the plantation. Now, as cotton became less profitable and there was more competition and so forth, and the cotton industry sort of reached a blight, because as this article from the New York Times in 1931 talks about, cotton was costing more to produce than it was bringing in an income. Okay, so cotton was sort of retrenching somewhat. So this gave an opportunity for the Chinese immigrants who were in that region to start opening grocery stores to replace the commissaries, because the commissaries were being closed anyway. So as you can see, there were those little black dots show you where all the plantations were. You can see it was very dense in the Mississippi Delta in this region, but all in Georgia, Alabama, and so forth. These are just a few visuals that give you images from like probably the 1920s and 1930s, or the exact dates on these pictures aren't exactly known, but a lot of these photographs were taken during the Depression to show you sort of what the agricultural life was like for the black people. The picture on the far right is a black school, like a one-room schoolhouse. You can sort of see it's pretty bare. And you can see the typical living arrangements were just sort of like a shotgun house, probably not much in the way of amenities, no heat probably, very minimal, and probably even no electricity in some of them. And over here is just sort of the foreman, and here's some of the workers. This is just a picture of what maybe one typical commissary might look like. And this would be the people working on the plantation coming in to buy their foods and so forth. Now, this is just a scene of segregation. This is a map of Clarksdale, which is one of the towns in the Delta. Clarksdale is sort of prides itself as sort of like the home of the blues and so forth. But this map, you can see, this is sort of called, what in this map is called the Negro business section. So on a typical street scene on a hot Saturday afternoon, people mill around. This is one of the juke joints where they might entertain themselves. This is a black theater because theaters, like everything else, was segregated at that time. Here you can see is the white business section. And so maybe this might be a street scene. They're playing dominoes there and just hanging out on the street. You can't see it, but this they even labeled as the poor white section, okay? So there's also a social class difference. Now, there is no Chinese section as such because there weren't that many Chinese there, actually. How did the Chinese get there? Well, there are different theories about how the Chinese came to places like Mississippi, but here's a sort of a political cartoon. In case you can't read it in the back because of the contrast, it says cheap labor wanted in the cotton fields, and this arrow, the directional arrow says south, because the Chinese became a problem, especially on the West Coast, because we became the yellow peril, because we worked for low wages and so forth. And so when there was a depression in the 1870s to virtually 1900, Chinese were blamed for being contributors to the problem. So there became this big effort to drive the Chinese out. And so this could be sort of like a cartoon depiction of the Irish or whatever trying to figure out what to do with the Chinese. And so, well, maybe we can send them south, we'll get them out of the West. And in fact, this is an article that sort of gives some from a newspaper, which sort of says, in effect, that in view of the Negro exodus from the South and the disturbed conditions of things in California, the planners in this part of the country, meaning Mississippi and other areas, are debating whether to bring in Chinese laborers. So a lot of the Chinese who came to the South in the early days were laborers, like in Augusta, Georgia. They built a canal because they had the expertise to do that. But again, they were brought in for labor. All right, now, even though they brought the Chinese in to do the labor in the cotton fields, the Chinese really didn't particularly feel that was what they wanted to do. So they filled this vacuum that I referred to when the commissaries started to close down and entered into the grocery business. Now, this is a demographic map. This map is 2000, U.S. Census. You can't see it too well, but in this map, the dark blue kind of things are where the Chinese are populated. You can see they're mostly in the West Coast and particularly California. You see there's really not too many in the middle, and there's a little cluster over here. So, but more specifically, if we look at the U.S. Census figures for Mississippi, and I also put Georgia in there because I have to keep Georgia in as a contrast. These two states had the most Chinese in the country. In the South, Mississippi had the most, and these numbers are like men, 400 approximately men in 1930. It's a big increase. They only had 300 about in 1920. Women, you can see, was even fewer, like maybe 100 women in 1930 and maybe less than 50 in 1920. And the gender difference is, very similar to other parts of the country at that point. The Chinese men came predominantly and much fewer women. And of course the consequence for this would be there would be obviously fewer children, certainly at least born in the US, unless the children were brought over from China. This shows that a sample from, again, like a census tract. What this shows is the names. The names aren't so important, but what I found were these were all born in the United States. Okay, they lived in Mississippi. Originally, the Chinese who were there came from China, but by 1920, 1930, there started to be some U.S.-born Chinese. Now, my first thought was, oh, maybe there are families in Mississippi starting to develop. But it turned out that when I looked at these U.S.-born Chinese, they were all, almost all, and this is true in other states as well, the vast majority have been born in California. But these weren't little kids. They were 52, 38, 44, 48, 37. Okay, so my original interpretation when I looked at, there were U.S.-born Chinese in Mississippi, I thought they were like young children, but they weren't. They were probably Chinese who either had like laundries or they were working in lumber or fishing and they were driven out of California. And what was happening was there was this sort of a remigration. This one other little diagram shows actually the 8 Chinese women in 1920 who were in Mississippi. And some of these were in their 40s. There was one in 23, and I think there was a 1-year-old, there was a 28, there was a 24. But over half of them were probably past childbearing age, okay? So even though there were these women there, they really didn't portend much for family development. That sort of really started developing after 1920. And it's a point that I'll come back to in a moment. Here are just a couple of other images that will kind of give you a flavor. This is actually one of the larger groceries. It's almost an iconic store in that it was in Mississippi, right on the Delta, the Joe Galnew grocery. And it was not only a grocery store, it was sort of a general store. It sold all kinds of goods. And it was also, from what I've learned, sort of like, because of the owner helped facilitate transportation, remigration, sort of like maybe even translating letters, writing letters. It was sort of like a trading post. And so a lot of Chinese would come from other small communities to this central location. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this diagram, but what I want to illustrate in a couple of diagrams is the way chain migration worked for the Chinese, which of course occurred in all areas of the U.S. I kind of happened upon this information. I knew that Chinese brought relatives from other parts of the U.S. or from China to come help them work. And basically they would sort of say to them, well, there's opportunity down here. You need to come and work and help us, and then you can sort of become independent. So I was visiting some Mississippi Chinese who live in Southern California, and I was trying to figure out certain things. So I was asking them about how did these Chinese, if they were really poor immigrants come in there, how did they raise capital to like buy the inventory to have a grocery store? I mean, even a small mom and pop grocery store. And so I was speculating. I said, well, I know that some of these men had laundries before, and then maybe they raised some money and saved some money there, and then opened a grocery store. And it just so happened, as I was talking about this, the wife of the person I was visiting walked by, and she heard me, and she said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "My grandfather had a laundry in New England." And then they came to Mississippi. Oh, boy, I struck it gold. I mean, I said, "Tell me more about this." And they had a lot of information. So basically, what this is the Joe Value store that I had that picture of. He must have been the original owner, maybe sometime in the 1880s. All right, these three brothers in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Joe Nam, Joe King, and Joe Guay, they had a laundry in Massachusetts. And they heard about the opportunities for opening a grocery store. So the two older brothers go down to Mississippi to check it out. And they said, "Wow, this is a lot easier than running a laundry." So they decided to go down there. They left one brother back in Massachusetts for a while, and then he came and joined them. And so that was how these men went down. Then they each ended up opening their own store, and it began to proliferate. And then they brought other relatives in, say, from China. So that's one of the simpler diagrams, actually. But this shows, and I'm sure you can't see it, but this is like a list of partners. These are 8 or 9 men who, the Moon family in Boyle and then later Cleveland, Mississippi. This is sort of like their agreement. They each deposited $1,000, and that made them partners in a merchant store. And this is very important for the Chinese immigration, because the Exclusion Act in 1882, which excluded Chinese, really, technically speaking, excluded laborers. If you were a merchant, which meant like you had capital and you were doing business or trade, then you would be eligible to enter the U.S. So in Mississippi, there were some laundries back before 1920. I mean, I've seen it on the census schedules. But most of the people that I talked to, had no memory of laundries because it was before their time. So every Delta Chinese I ever talked to said, "No, we never had any laundries." So I whip out a sheet of paper from the U.S. Census that said, "Look, 1910, there was this laundry down on Walnut Street right next to the Joe Galnu, almost, grocery store." And of course, they had no memory of this. But very oddly, I was down in Mississippi in September, and there were some people visiting there, some Chinese people visiting from Illinois. It turns out that these people were related to the people who ran the laundry in 1910. And so again, I kind of struck gold just by accident. And so they didn't remember a whole lot, but they did remember growing up in a laundry in the Mississippi Delta. And the mother, who was actually doing most of the work, because apparently the father liked to gamble a lot, so he wasn't too helpful. So the mother then decided, "Hey, doing laundry is too much work, I'm moving over to a grocery store." And then that's how that all came about. So that was kind of a little interesting sidelight of doing this kind of research. So this is why they formed these partnerships, to be able to get into the country and be able to open their own store. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but just to show you the complexity of this migration pattern. These are 3 families, separate families, who ended up in the Arkansas Delta on the other side of the river from Mississippi, running grocery stores. One family, the Wongs, started out, say, having a restaurant in Durango, Colorado, and then they went up north first. They went to Minnesota and ran restaurants in North Dakota, kind of paralleling the Northern Pacific Railroad. Another family started out in Mexico, went all the way up to Michigan to do a laundry, and came to Havana, Illinois in 1919 to have a laundry, and then they got to Arkansas. This other family started in Boston with the laundry. They moved to Chicago and Detroit as the father as a restaurant waiter, and then he moved to Mississippi. So then these people start getting, like intermarriages between the different families and so forth. So all these people down at this level were running grocery stores on the Arkansas side, but their roots originally came from other quite distant, remote parts of the United States. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that probably the majority of those people in Mississippi did not go directly there. It wasn't like a destination. They were trying to say, oh, we got to get to Mississippi. They were doing things in other parts of the United States, then they were driven out of these other places by prejudice and so forth. Like, even in a place like Wyoming, there was a big massacre, the Rock Springs Massacre, okay? So the Chinese fled, trying to find safer places, and the South seemed to be one of those places. This is a photograph about 1900 or 1910 of a very prominent family, there were like 10 children in the Pang family. I met this lad, or this one, Pat Pang. I think he's like 95 and sharp as a tack, still drives a car. In Mississippi, you can drive a car a lot longer because of the way they drive. You know, they're not racing around like here, but still, it's quite remarkable. So he told me a lot of very interesting things. You can't see the detail in this picture, but up here is like an advertisement for Remington rifles and so forth. And hunting was really big down in Mississippi, but even back in that time. Here are just some scenes, just to give you a few visual images of what some of the stores look like. These stores, photographs were probably in the 1930s, 1940s, and maybe even one in the 1950s. One thing you'll notice is, unlike modern grocery stores where you go in and pick out your own merchandise, most of the stuff was behind the counter. So you had to go in and ask for it, and the grocery man or his family would get it for you. This is a more contemporary thing. When I was in September, when I was there in Ruleville, you can see now the way the goods are arranged is different. Where did the Chinese live? Just like with the laundries, the immigrant families live in or above or next to their store. They, like in this case, in the Mijong store, which you're quite familiar with, Rachel. You're not in this picture, are you?
I'm not in the picture, but my sister is.
Yeah. So I don't dare take a chance saying who's who, because you contradict your correction. I was struck by this photograph on the right. I discovered it, and there's an interesting story that I won't get into detail about it, but trying to identify who these people were and who owned it. It was I had about 10 rounds of emails with different people trying to say who owned this picture. It was kind of interesting. The other picture is also in that store. Is that a party of some sort? Or?
Yes, we always had our parties in the store. We just push the
Right.
shelves aside.
Yeah, so it's like a multi-purpose room where you just moved all the merchandise around and squeezed everyone in. And so Chinese were not allowed to buy property for a long time in the South, and Mississippi included. And so that would be one reason to live in the store. Another reason to live in the store was it's convenient and it saved money and so forth. And also, you could protect your property from theft and so forth because you're there right on the premises. So there are a lot of different reasons for that.
What year was that?
These pictures were probably the 40s, weren't they? Yeah, 40s and 50s. In this particular images, yeah.
We have another person that's in that picture. She's here today.
Oh, who is that?
She's that little girl that's on the right-hand side of the corner.
Oh, on the right-hand side of the corner? Okay,
Give
so
her the
let's
pointer.
see. If I can get that back. Okay.
Here on the right-hand side.
Oh, yeah. All right. You look very happy there. You're the witch crackers. Okay. This one, actually, I have a little short movie, but I guess it doesn't work on this computer. But this is a store in Greenwood that I visited. It was a big store. It was like almost like a general store. And she had a little bit of everything in there. In fact, I couldn't even find the food for a while. It almost looked like she didn't have food. And she had one section all full of PVC pipe. So she made a lot of money selling, plastic pipe for plumbing and everything. So she was an all-purpose store. And she ran the store with her 80-year-old mother, and they've been robbed 7 times, okay? But they still run the store. It's in their blood. They're really intrepid about that. All right, what I want to describe, and I owe a lot to James Wing for this because he had written something for his children which sort of described what I call the ebb and flow of the day, what the patterns were. All right, so I've condensed it a whole lot, but what he describes is sort of like, well, what happens in the morning when you get up? Okay, there's a certain routine, getting set up and so forth, like taking out the fresh vegetables and the fruit from the refrigerators and putting them out, taking out the withered ones and discarding certain things, and then saving the ones that are still edible and eating them themselves. I mean, this is what you did in the grocery store. You sowed stuff that was left over that you couldn't sell, but that's what the family ate, quite often at least. And the father, in this case, getting up at 5 a.m. to go buy fresh produce to bring it to the store. So once the store opens, it's very informal, especially in a small rural area. Like you get these housewives coming in, without getting all fresh, just hustling over to get food. Remember, in those days, there wasn't much in the way of refrigeration in the home, and especially poor people might have like an ice box or something like that. So they had to go buy food every day. So in the morning, he describes like early on, the people who are going to work out in the fields are coming by to grab some food. School children are coming by to get school supplies. And then later, there's like a little lull, and then the delivery men and the salesmen come and deliver and so forth. And so they have a certain procedure to work out. The children very often worked, and this is before they went to school or after school, like restocking shelves and so forth. So there are all these various family functions. Everyone in the family contributed in some way. So then we reach mid-morning, and then, like between 9 and 11, there's a certain other activity because the laborers have already come and gone. So now they're dealing with salesmen. He said that he felt that a lot of the salesmen weren't trustworthy and they cheated them, and so they'd have to double check the count, make sure you're getting what you bought and so forth. So then by around lunchtime, now people are coming in, so his store was almost like a lunchroom as well, because people would come buy the food and then sort of eat right there, right on the premises. Laborers, would come in to eat lunch in there. They would buy food and they would eat it. And then after they ate, the grocery family would have to clean up and so forth. And then they had like a little lull at early afternoon. Things was quiet, the deliveries and so forth. And then when school let out, then there's another wave of activity. Like children would come by to buy their candies and so forth. And then there'd be late afternoon type of thing. People are coming to buy food to cook for the evening meal because they had no frozen food then and so forth. So they had to have everything pretty much fresh. And then the people who've been working all day are finishing up and they're coming by. So now, business is picking up. And then even late into the evening, see, the day's not over just because people have gotten off work. Some people then come back to hang out, like after it gets dark, they come to hang out and just talk and so forth. I was talking to someone yesterday whose family had a grocery store in Augusta, and I'm sure there were a lot of similarities there. And he said that what his experience is that the grocery store owners cultivated the black people to stick around and linger around until they closed, because they felt this was security, because a lot of these people would get robbed, and then unfortunately some of them actually got murdered in the store, over small amount of money. So what this grocery man did, and I can't say that they all did it, he realized that if he could maintain customers hanging around until he's closed up, he would have more security. And so that's a strategy. After closing, now you've got some other work to do, okay, just because you close up. And maybe you've got to clean up, and you've also got to have a meal prepared. So in this case, after closing, father cooked the meal, whatever was still unsewed and so forth. And then the next morning they would repeat the same cycle, Monday through Friday. Now Friday was a little bit different because now the weekend is coming up. The people are getting paid and they're coming in to cash their checks and settle their debts and so forth, and maybe splurge a little bit. And you also had the fact that a lot of men now not having to go work the next day maybe are coming to get drunk, or being drunk or coming in the store and creating some sorts of little arguments either with the grocery people or with other people. Saturdays is also different, okay? Very busy day. This was also true like in the laundry business. This was the day when they made a lot of their revenues, but this was a time when everyone in the family had to be there to do their share. And then he describes like Sundays. Now you had to get ready for the next week, so there was like really work to do every day. Sundays was maybe a half day they would stay open, and then later men would start going to church activities and so forth. So this was sort of like a cycle that became a way of life for these people, and a routine that they almost never varied. Now, we know that black-white segregation in schools, and wasn't ended until much after the Civil Rights Movement. Even though the Civil Rights Movement, Brown versus Board of Education was 64 ruling. It's 54. I'm sorry. It still took more than a dozen years later before actually school desegregation occurred. But what about with the Chinese? Okay, where did they fit? And that was a difficult problem for many communities to resolve. In some of the small towns, I'm told that there wasn't a problem if there were few Chinese there, and also the merchant was very popular or well-liked, or had good relations with the leaders in the community. They didn't have a problem with their children going to white school, which was far superior in terms of quality of education than in the black schools. In the larger cities like Greenville, where there were more Chinese, Chinese were not allowed to go to white schools until about 1950. So these newspaper articles deal with a case in 1924, I believe. And this is one headline says, "Shut white school to Mississippi Chinese." And then the second column deals with a court case, because there was this case where a girl was prevented from going to school in Rosedale, and the father took it to the got a lawyer and took it to court, and eventually it went to the Supreme Court. And they still sort of maintained that Chinese were not allowed to go to white schools, that they had to go to the colored school, because they said, Chinese are colored, blacks are colored school. So in this case, the family left and moved to Arkansas, because in Arkansas, Chinese were not prohibited from going to white schools. So this created a problem for the Chinese. As we know, they value education. So not being able to go to the good schools, how did the Chinese deal with this? Well, one solution was have your own school, in a sense. And the churches were very instrumental. The Baptist church in particular was very instrumental in providing instruction and teaching and so forth for Chinese, so they could deal with this problem of not having to go to the inferior black schools. But this was a kind of a interesting win-win situation for both the church and for the Chinese, because the church wanted to recruit the Chinese to Christianity. Many of these missionaries were leaving China sort of in frustration, because they really weren't all that successful overall in getting Christianity into China, and then also political developments with the war and everything breaking out with Japan. A lot of these missionaries came back to the United States to various places, and then they suddenly realized, we've got all these Chinese right here in Mississippi. Why don't we, get them involved with the church? And so it took a sort of a period of getting them interested in being part of the church. And one of the carrots that they offered was education. And so the parents, the immigrants, may not have initially been that interested in the church, but they saw that there was something of value for their children via the educational opportunities. Here's just a a couple of pictures of children in the Chinese school. So you can see this was from the interior that the facilities, even by today's standards, aren't that great, but they were much better than the picture I showed you of the black school. And usually they have a white instructor, and the children were pretty conscientious students, and they did very well. And this is a picture of a Chinese Baptist Mission Church in Cleveland. This was, I think, one of the first, and many of the children who lived far away actually came and lived in a dormitory there for a while. So this is how the intersection of Christianity and the Chinese and education sort of played a really important role in helping the Chinese be able to get the education that enabled many of them to go to college and beyond. Now, as time goes by, obviously the second generation has become more assimilated, and there are certainly a couple of images. I'm sure the immigrant parents didn't expect their children to be playing football, but being Americanized, this obviously was something that was going to become attractive to children. So it even makes the newspaper where it says, 4 Chinese boys that are on these teams. So it was such a, I guess a transitional point of view, and also American-style dancing for teenagers and so forth. The dance was an interesting sort of thing because the Chinese was spread all over the Delta. The Delta roughly like maybe 100, 150 miles north-south, and maybe 50 miles east-west. And you got a lot of little towns like 20, 30 miles apart. And each of these towns has 1 or 2 or 3 families. And so when the children were small, what would happen is maybe on weekends the parents would get together and they'd play mahjong, and they would have like community or collective lunches or dinners, and the little small children would all get to know each other and become acquainted with other Chinese children. And then later, when those children became teenagers, the parents let them have the car or the truck, and they would go to places like Cleveland or Greenville, and to some dance hall, and I'm told that they, would stay out pretty late, which, you would think would be kind of surprising, knowing how strict Chinese immigrant parents would be. But at the same time, they realized that this was the way the Chinese were going to get to meet other Chinese, because otherwise they would be, isolated in all these various towns. And so a lot of people I've talked to from Mississippi, they all really reminisce and talk about all those dances and everything. So I would imagine they must all be very good dancers. Obviously, one of the big events, of course, in any culture is weddings, and you can see that it looks like everyone in Mississippi was at this wedding. In this banquet hall, I think they would rent something like the Veteran of Foreign Wars Hall or something. They didn't have their own facility, I don't believe. And up in the upper right is a man who I didn't realize who he was for a while. I heard that he was sort of like considered kind of the Chinese godfather, that he was very influential, and so he's speaking at this banquet that if you needed stuff, he was the man to see. Now, I made a little map. This is by no means exhaustive, but I tried to look at the intermarriage across the different regions. So I'm sure you can't read this in the back or anything, but each little arrow is connecting one town to another town. Like someone from Duncan married someone from Rosedale. It was a Gong-Jew marriage. Or Marigold and Clarksdale, or Cleveland and Marksdale. I was interested in like the networks, okay? So everywhere you see an arrow is a marriage between someone in one town, one town and another. Because when I did this research, I got really confused for a while because there are a lot of Chows and a lot of Joes, and every name seemed to be the same. And when I started talking to people, they said, "Oh, well, that's my cousin. Oh, that's my uncle. That's my brother's sister-in-law." And then I started realizing, all these people are marrying other people pretty much from within that delta. So I went and asked someone, name me all the marriages of your generation. And yeah, they were all pretty much very closely interwoven. is the point that I was making. Now, the Chinese maintained as many traditions as they could, isolated though they were. And certainly they honored and respected, their ancestors and their parents and the deceased. So Chinese were not allowed to be in a white cemetery, and also they developed their own cemetery. And you can see they put Chinese decorations on it. And I visited there because I happened to be there on the day that this plaque that you see in the lower right, we made it to sort of like a historic monument. It's the first Chinese cemetery in the Delta. And so they had a big media thing to sort of commemorate this event. You can see that over time the grocery has diminished and is really almost very minimal. Here are two stores. One is the Zhou New number 2, not the original one that I showed you originally. And that was what it was like, say, back in the 40s or the late 30s. It was busy. And now it's just a shell of itself. It's just kind of an empty storefront there that hasn't been used for anything, I guess. And this is the Mijan grocery store that we showed you earlier, where people were inside having family gatherings and so forth. And it too is now basically an abandoned, dilapidated shell of itself. So these pictures I took in September when I was there. So this is kind of symbolic of what's happened. As time went by, the original immigrants have died or gone back to China. The children have become highly educated and professional, so they're not entering the grocery stores. So there's only a handful left. Now, what I wanted to do is sort of talk about how people growing up in the Delta felt about their experience being Chinese growing up in the Delta. There is no one view. I got a spectrum. I don't know exactly how many are prevalent, but there were different views. And so what I'm just going to do is give you a quick overview of several different views. So this person left Mississippi in 1973. He didn't really want to go back. He didn't think there was any future there. He remembers the prejudice. He remembers the segregation. He remembers how he was confused about black-white relationships. And so he really didn't like it. He said Chinese really don't have a place in society being there. So that's one point of view, but not necessarily the most common view. This is another view, which is a little more in the middle. He sort of describes the things, and also, for example, he talks about, like during the civil rights movement, Chinese grocers were between a rock and a hard place. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them had predominantly black customers. And then you had like the White Citizens Council, which is sort of like the racist group. And so the Chinese grocers would often like try to play both sides, like they'd pay some respect to the White Citizens Council by even donating money to them, and yet also sort of trying to do things that would help the black community. So that was sort of the schizophrenic kind of situation that he described. Okay, this one, the font didn't come out right, so you're not going to read this. Let me tell you what this one is about. This person talked about a couple of reminiscences. Once when he had his appendix removed and appendectomy, they wouldn't let him in the white hospital. They had to rush him to a black hospital, but they let a white doctor do the operation. And then talked about they were playing football once, and the young brother got hit in the face, and his glasses were broken, and he got a piece of glass in his eye. They rushed him to the hospital, and they wouldn't let him in because he was not white, so they had to send him somewhere else. Interestingly, in the bottom paragraph, he said, growing up in Chinese Delta afforded me lots of a variety of life experiences. I guess we can say that. Caucasian, blacks, and white society. And he feels that growing up Chinese in the Delta was, very best of times and worst of times. But he has a very positive outlook despite the experiences that he had. Here's someone who describes like the fact that they were becoming more assimilated, and the parents were maybe upset about it, but at the same time, he recognizes that, because we were leaving and not going back to the grocery stores, and in a way, we the Chinese succeeded, became very active in community, maybe not politically in office, but many of them became highly trained professionals. However, his position is, and that's the bottom thing, he questions whether, his generation, the second generation, third generation, fourth generation Chinese have really, quote, made it. He says, yeah, we're better off economically, but money's only one measure of power, and only a minimal means of entrance into the white Mississippi society. So he thinks that, the Chinese were still sort of like second class, even though they had improved their lot considerably. So that's a spectrum of the views that I found kind of interesting. And some of this varied depending on what community they grew up in. But I was also very struck by the fact that almost all the Chinese that I met from the Delta had some sort of strong emotional tie. And this is exemplified by the fact that in 1987, after which many of the people who grew up in the groceries had left, that in Greenville, they organized an event that they called the Big Event, which was like a reunion. They invited all the Chinese from the Delta who had been there to come down for one weekend. And the little map just sort of shows like how far they scattered, mostly in the warm southern states, the kind of spectrum. All those states along the bottom, most of them were Texas or California. But all those people came. They had like 500 or 600 people come, and that red book is like an album which has photographs of it. So I was struck by the fact that this event was held and that it was such a successful, memorable thing that people were very tied to their sense of being in the South. This is just one person's sort of family tree of success that someone sent me logos of things that their children and grandchildren and brothers and sisters or whatever have all sort of made it economically in terms of professional careers with leading corporations and so forth. So what I want to sort of maybe in answering questions is sort of say my own experience in doing this project was I think very informative to me, even though I came from the South and I could relate to a lot of what they felt. At the same time, I learned a lot of different things because I grew up in a Chinese community where we were the only Chinese. And so I was struck by the fact that in the Delta, even though there were a lot of little towns like that, all those Chinese really networked and they all got to know each other. And they all really felt a kindred kind of relationship, both as Chinese and as Southerners. Okay, so even some of the people I thought to have moved away, they still feel Southern. So that maybe even though they might be in California or New York, they still sort of feel like they have some different experiences as Chinese in America. So that's why I think it was really important to be able to be a part of recording this. And it was kind of gratifying too. I was a little worried when I did this because I didn't know how well it would be received by the people I was writing about. See, when I wrote about myself, I only had myself and my family to account to. But now that I was writing about all these other people, I had to worry, like, is this going to come through as fair representation of their experience? So fortunately, most of the people who responded have said, yeah, we're happy that you did this, and it helps us preserve our history. And the other reason that I want to do this is I wasn't writing this mainly for Mississippi Chinese. I think all Americans, Chinese or otherwise, in other parts of the country, I hope that eventually, some of them would be interested in knowing about this really unusual environment, down in the Delta and those circumstances, very different from California. So with that, I just want to throw it open to any questions.
There's one down here. Adults.
Yes.
Hi, John.
Hi.
John, thank you so much for this really interesting talk. It's wonderful. I was curious, in the Delta, did you have access to Chinese foods and vegetables or grow like chopsticks?
Oh, okay, all right. Did I or did the Mississippi Delta?
Both.
Okay. When I was in Georgia, yeah, we had some because there are Chinese grocers in Florida, so we could buy fresh produce from time to time that would be shipped up. I know in Atlanta, my aunt, she had her own garden in the backyard. She had grew all kinds of Chinese stuff, so she didn't go to the store to buy it. She was self-sufficient. In Mississippi, I know that they grew a lot. When I was down there in September, I saw the most humongous winter melon I've ever seen in the back of some guy's store. He had about a dozen of them sitting on the shelf there, and he was telling me that they lasted for however long, you know. So, yeah, being agricultural and in a rich soil that they have in Mississippi, you can grow just about anything. So the Chinese there did grow their own fresh produce. The other stuff, like other Chinese in other parts of the country, would order, you know, like preserved stuff, the dried stuff from San Francisco, Chinatown, or something like that. But they know how to cook down there, and they know how to eat down there. I mean, and I was there for 2 weeks. That's all we did was eat, basically. But there are not really a lot of like Chinese restaurants as such. Or if you go to a Chinese restaurant there, it's really somewhat catering to non-Chinese because most of the customers are going to be either black or white, and so you have to alter it. You can't serve authentic Chinese food. Yes?
In growing up back there, if we didn't have a certain item, we would go to Joe Avenue number 2 and buy some of the canned goods because they had a supply there.
Oh, yeah.
And then we would order from Chicago or San Francisco.
Right. Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Yes?
My office, I remember living in Arkansas. I remember my mother making some of the ingredients. She would buy the things like and then make it at home, like the tofu. She would actually do that herself.
Yes?
In 51, a family came from Mississippi, and we got to be very good friends. Then I was inducted, went into the Air Force and stationed in Atlanta. So I said, well, I'm going to go to Mississippi and visit the family, the G family. I don't know if anybody knows the G family. They came out here because the daughter wanted to go to Cal. So,
What town was that? What city was that?
there, Marigold was one.
Marigold.
Oldest daughter was living in Marigold. And then Clarksdale, they had a gentleman's birthday, 80th birthday or something. And I was invited to attend that. And like you said, everyone from Arkansas, Mississippi was there. And they catered their food from Chicago. All right. Roast pastry and all. That was quite an experience.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know they catered from Chicago, but I do know like they would have a lot of big gatherings of many families, and everyone would do some contribution or cooking and so forth. Like I was even invited to someone's wedding party. I didn't even know them, but a relative of a relative said, "Come on down, you'll be welcome." I didn't go, but I kind of would feel a little intrusive. But that's their, Southern hospitality.
They have traveling chefs.
Travel.
Walk.
Oh yeah.
And you take gas.
Oh, okay.
And then they will cook out, outside.
All right, but with those traveling cooks, they were from the Delta? Yes.
Clarksdale mainly.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay,
So in that big hall you saw, the different college kids will be the waiters and waitresses.
Oh, I see, all right, okay. Yeah, so, yeah.
And then whenever I would go home, I always took 1 or 2 dozen ducks.
All right, yeah. That's true. That reminds me once when we were living in Atlanta with relatives, when we were in San Francisco, relatives coming from Atlanta. My mother went down to Chinatown and bought like a dozen ducks, and then they took them back on the plane. Yes?
Was the family associations active down there?
Family associations. Maybe you can answer that better. Family associations.
Were they active?
We weren't, they tried to establish them there, but it didn't take hold.
But they're on there.
One there.
Yeah.
Give her the mic. Come on.
Yeah, so there was an online, it was in Greenville. Yeah. Right. Someone else? Yes,
I was wondering, John, are your guests from Mississippi and Arkansas, are they presently living in the Bay Area?
the ones here, I think are all, yeah, right, they're all in the Bay Area. They're all refugees from Mississippi.
So they all moved from Mississippi, Arkansas?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. But,
But a lot of professional in Jackson, Mississippi.
right, yeah. And Memphis, yeah.
We couldn't get jobs back there, so we had to move out.
Well, that's true, right. There was job discrimination too. Yeah, in fact, in my book, I have examples of that where people have highly trained. And one woman said, you know, she went for the interview and everything, and they said, well, I'm sorry, I can't hire you. And she said, well, what's wrong? My qualifications meet those that are specified. And so he told her, he says, well, I just can't hire you because we don't hire people like you. And she said something like, well, what am I? You know, and he said, well, you're Chinese. Okay. So that was the situation, certainly well into the 50s. Not late, yeah.
I'm just curious, were the blacks slaves or were they
No.
free?
No, they weren't slaves at that time, no. Well, emancipation was technically 1863, so, yeah. By then, I'm not absolutely sure. I don't think slaves were on the cotton plantations. I mean, they were sharecroppers, which meant that they were like leased some land, basically, and they raised the crop, and then they'd have to sell it to the owner of the plantation at a certain price and so forth. But, you know, it was a very poor life existence. Yeah.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I want to, you asked me to ask some of you guests here. Is anybody here from Arkansas? Oh, one from Arkansas, Alabama, and Georgia. Oh, Georgia. There's two already. Louisiana. And the bill says, when we say people from the South, it doesn't mean Los Angeles. Or Southern China, right? So that's very interesting today. Listen, he's going to stay for lunch, and the guest will be on this side of room, and he has book for sale, and there's a discount, right?
Yeah, well, I decided, because I'm family or kind of thing, I've been here 3 times now, so if I get invited 4 times.
Yeah.
So I'm having a recession special, any book $10.
$10?
Yeah.
And no tax?
Well, $10 tax.
Okay. Okay, there. Anyway, he's supposed to all hear, and you people can talk with him later on. And I'm so happy that all you people come from San Francisco in the rainy weather like this here, and it was such a nice turnout. But you know, you people visitor, we have the same amount of people every week. It's really a real good educational program. Now, Bill, like I said, you're working. No. Anybody else has any?